So it looks like people are slowly still joining, but I think I will just get started with some quick logistics before we dive in. So hello everyone, my name is Julia Madison and I'm the technical manager for this session on the cost and affordability of nutritious diets, which is chaired by Anna Horforth, William Masters, and Rachel Gilbert. And so thank you so much for taking part in ANH 2021, and we look forward to a very robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything you need to access the conference materials and program can be found at ANH Academy website at anh-academy.org/ANH2021. Before Will takes the conversation forward, I just have a few technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. First, this session is now being recorded and will be posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please introduce yourself in the chat function. Let us know your name, where you are joining us from, and the organization you work with. We encourage you to share your webcam feed during this session, but if your connection is bad, we recommend turning your video off. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation for discussion. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we will do our best to answer them throughout the session and as well during the Q&A section. And lastly, at any point, if you have any technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link used to join today. If you have any technical questions, please send me a private message using the chat box. So thank you all again for joining, and I will hand it over to Will to get us started.
Thank you so much, Julia, and to the whole ANH Academy team for making this possible. As you know, this is the 6th annual ANH Academy Week. This is one of the very first sessions of the week, and this is the second time we've been forced to do it entirely online. This has been a horrific year for all of us, I think, and many different kinds of ways. Lives disrupted, condolences to everybody who's lost a family member, someone in your community, lives disrupted in every country of the world, most recently now in South Asia, in Brazil. And it's also been a year of reinvention, of discovery, of building communities in new ways, in new places. And this food prices for nutrition work that we'll talk about today is one of those communities that have developed around new ways of understanding the world, that shed light on how COVID response and resilience has occurred through food prices for nutrition, but also helped us to address the longstanding challenges that we could not solve before, but that we can now through the data that we'll talk about today. Through bringing each other's expertise to bear on analyzing those data. So we desperately need your insights, what you will type in the chat box today, what you'll share with each other in the exercise that we'll do together at the end of the day. And we'll be hearing from Tayo Adeyemi, who's been leading an effort to apply this in one particular country, in Nigeria, and she will share that example, which I think is inspiring, I hope is inspiring to all of us and to you to think about how food prices for nutrition can lead to astonishing insights and drive change in the way that our food markets do or don't deliver a healthy diet to everyone at all times. So we'll be led in this by colleagues who have been driving this agenda for a very long time. So most of the presentation will come from Anna Horforth. And if you haven't followed her work, you should. You can start with the Twitter handle, Anna W. Horforth. My own work has been in this area for a very long time, but I'm only now learning nutrition, learning it from Anna and others. And we'll also be led in this by Rachel Gilbert, who has been building these interest groups and data user groups within countries that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and UK aid funded Food Prices for Nutrition project is working with, but also connecting to the many other groups that are working in this domain adjacent to ours. So you'll see this on our website, sites.tufts.edu/food prices for nutrition. We also use the Food Prices for Nutrition hashtag on Twitter and on LinkedIn to build this community that we can help to develop in this conversation today. So please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat box now, and we'll do a slightly more formal kind of introduction using the chat box in a moment. But Rachel, the next slide gives us the whole agenda for this conversation. So I will stop talking shortly to let Anna share the vision and the aims of this work. She will also walk us through how these cost and affordability indicators and methods actually work. And during that time, and we'll have a little warm up for this in a moment, it'll be up to you with fingers on the keyboard to use the chat box to share when you have a question, when you say, this doesn't make sense, this is confusing, or you have an insight. You say, I saw this, I noticed this, I can do this. We want to hear that in the chat box. So we'll have a little warm up for the Q&A conversation. Then Anna will share the insights that we as a project and others working with us in World Food Program and national governments have come from these national case studies. We have been able to compare across countries, within countries, and see some things that were never visible before because of using food prices in this new way. Then breakout rooms for a hands-on activity to do this yourselves with what we call pseudo data, hypothetical data, made up data, not real, but realistic. And that will give you a very interesting first taste of this if you haven't done it before, to know that this is within reach. You can do this in your own settings, whether it's least cost diets and affordability for a small community in a particular place, whether it's a whole country, or whether it's comparing across countries. That will then lead us to have Tayo's insights from the example of her work leading this in Nigeria, and we'll close with next steps. So the next slide gives us the toolkit for this new way of building a community, this new form of engagement. We are all sheltering in one way or another. We're also trying to have a low carbon conversation where we don't have to travel, we can travel less, but meet more. We can engage with each other more. So to do that, it's like any group, we need to step back and let others talk for a minute before you have a chance. So make sure that your videos, well, your videos will be off now, but and you're muted now. But when we come into the group session, that's important. Then the next advance gives the reminder that anything you say in the chat will be recorded and will be used and is enormously valuable. But don't put anything in the chat that you don't want to have be shared. And the next point is that we have much more opportunity for interaction than is otherwise possible. If we were together in a physical room, that would be very nice. I could see you, we could chat, have coffee afterwards, but only one person can talk at a time if we were together in a physical room. But because we're on Zoom, each of you can type at the same time. And so we'll be using polls and we'll be using chats to have an even more active conversation where lots of engagement can occur. So the next advance emphasizes the use of kind of all the reaction tools, and that you'll see opportunities to do that throughout. So on to the next. What we'll see is the chance to just use the chat box just to show you what a cascade of things looks like. Okay, so by a cascade of things in the chat box, what I mean is, let's jump to the second question. Since you've already typed your names, just list the countries, just the one word line of countries. And the idea is that the chat box you should have open, almost always it's on the right of your screen. Just enter the one word of country. And the one word of country will be a short little thing. We'll just see lots of countries go by. So that's a beautiful thing. Like what you're seeing in your chat box, I mean, seriously, it's like amazing. And what this gives us is an opportunity to use that chat box to share, sometimes a very brief, like one word thing, the country where you are, but we can also pivot to sharing something a little richer. So after you've typed the country, can you share like, why are you here? What brought you to this topic? What questions, what puzzles, what problems do you want to solve that would be really helpful just to see a brief cascade of the challenges you face, the opportunities you see in this conversation here today. So Kadir has written, to learn more. That's great. Just curiosity is the motor of so much discovery. But of course, a lot of curiosity is very driven towards a particular goal. So Leah Sam writes, to understand equalities and of course, inequalities. To Mukani writes, to improve dissemination, to make sure that we can share, that we come up with a result, a story, an explanation that we can share and disseminate. Carolina writes, she's already seen this before. Carolina's seen this through the World Food Program's Fill the Nutrient Gap work. Isabella Janti writes, interested in a particular food. She's interested in the use of insect foods for nutrition. And that's really interesting challenge is, can we bring those in, and what do least cost and most affordable diets tell us about the role of new foods or neglected foods that that are, of course, been used for time immemorial, but are not available in markets today in large quantities. So I really appreciate you sharing these motivations. And Rachel, you could advance to the next slide. We have some yes or no polls just to get you practiced using the poll feature. So the poll feature allows us to get a qualitative yes, no, or don't know response. So you should have, if you click on the polls button at the bottom of your screen, the poll comes up saying, asking the question, are you working from home right now due to COVID-19? So right now, meaning at this particular hour, this moment, right now. So I am, and so far, 80% of respondents have said yes, 20% have said no, still holding at 80% yeses, still 80% yeses. It's settled down at 79% yes, 18% no. So I would guess that that's typical of knowledge workers in the world. We are able to work from home. Of course, so many of the people we rely on who do the harder work, the more personal face-to-face work in food supply, but so many other sectors, healthcare and so forth, they don't have the luxury of working at home. I remember that every day during the COVID pandemic. And, but we are about 80% at home and 20% able to go to the office. A next question, Rachel, is about experience. The poll you see now is the same questions, yes, no, or maybe. Did you attend our learning lab last year? So is this a repeat for you? And so far we have about 20% yes, did attend last year, which is great, because you, the 20% who did attend last year, can share a little more insight, observation, experience. When you type in the chat box, we want to hear from you. That it's now 78%, 79%. I'll end the polling and share those results, who are newcomers. So this Learning Lab is designed for you. It's designed principally for the 80% who were not in the Learning Lab last year. There will be something new for the 20% who saw it before, but it is entirely built to be an on-ramp, to be accessible, friendly, and useful initial exposure to what I hope you will discover is an amazing realm of new kinds of work that sheds light and helps us address the goals that you had at the beginning of this, in the chat box a moment ago. So the next advance, next slide, gets us to the motivation. And Anna, can you tell us why we're here? What's the goal? What's the vision and the aims of this work?
Thanks so much, Will. It's really wonderful to hear why you all are here. from the really active chat box. Thank you for that. Thanks, Will, for getting us all started so nicely. And the food prices for nutrition team is here. It's kind of all in the name. We want to use food prices for nutrition. There's abundant food price data in the world, which is a really fortunate thing. We have not, we're only beginning to harness that data to be able to use it for nutrition, for decision making. Our vision with this project is that we want to have metrics and methods which can reflect this shared global vision of food security, which was actually agreed 25 years ago now. It's this beautiful definition of a vision for all people, which is food security is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this is still the definition that's used within the UN, within most countries. And, there are many ways to measure food security. And to date, they have mostly been around calories and more recently the experience of food insecurity. And our team adds a way of understanding physical and economic access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs, which is a piece of this definition that's been there for 25 years, but that the existing metrics of food security haven't quite captured until we bring in the use of, well, do people have economic access? Are nutritious foods to meet dietary needs accessible, or are they unaffordable to people? So we use our metrics to monitor and track progress towards this vision. Next slide. So more specifically, what we want to know is if you went to the market in any country, how much would it cost to obtain a healthy diet? Again, that nutritious food to meet dietary needs. And then secondly, how many people in the country or whatever population you're working with, village, region, continent, cannot afford that cost of a healthy diet? Next slide. So we use market prices. We fully recognize that people have many food environments, only one of which is the market. There's also cultivated food environments and wild food environments. And that even so, it's important to look at prices in the market, because even for people who produce a lot of their own food, even rural farm families rely on market purchases for healthy, diverse diets throughout the year. Very tiny minority of people in the world produces everything that they eat or would need to eat. So you can see in these charts here, which come from Ethiopia, rural Ethiopia, that you can see there's a lot of sourcing food from own production, but also from purchased, and that shifts over the months of the year, where in some seasons, the purchased foods become a greater share of the diet than own production, and vice versa. And then when we're talking about, access to food, access to the complete components of healthy, diverse diets, we have to think about the different food groups. So some food groups are much more likely to be purchased in rural areas, as you can see in this Ethiopia example, than others. So where people are more likely to produce their own cereals, tubers, and dairy if it's consumed, but much more likely to purchase the legumes, vegetables, fruits, eggs, fish, and meat to round out the diverse diet. So here, our metrics are looking at prices in the market as an indicator of economic access. Next slide. We have 3 indicators that we use to estimate least cost diets. The first indicator is the energy sufficient diet, which is only just the cost of achieving adequate calories or adequate energy for a day. It's the minimum cost meeting energy requirements, just using one single least expensive available starchy staple food in a particular time and place. So this is not a recommended diet by any means. It's really the most basic survival that is not something that anyone should be aiming for. Unfortunately, there are people in the world who do have this on any given day. So we kind of use this as the baseline comparison of the absolute minimum to keep flesh and bones together. And then the next one is the nutrient adequate diet, which adds to the energy, the minimum nutrient requirements, and also the upper bounds of not having any risk of toxicity or other risks from too high amounts of nutrients. And this is kind of this is a diet that is done through linear programming and is a theoretical lower bound on what a person would, the exact components of specific foods to meet these nutrient requirements of 23 macro and micronutrients, not too little and not too much, in order to achieve nutrient adequacy. But of course, people don't actually approach food choices in that way. You know, we approach food choices not in terms of knowing exactly what nutrients are in them, but knowing what the food items are and generally sort of what function they provide in the diet, whether they're, you know, a fruit or a vegetable or a starchy staple. So that comes into play in the cost of a healthy diet or cost of recommended diet, which is the minimum cost to meet food-based dietary guidelines based on food group classifications. So this is both a kind of behaviorally realistic way to meet nutrient needs and other needs, such as proportionality between food groups, you know, having more starchy staples than protein-rich foods, for example, and also to reflect norms and culture and protection of health against non-communicable disease. So next slide. I want to emphasize that the least cost diet methodology looks for the most affordable, cheapest, lowest cost combination of foods that meet the criteria of these three diets. So there's no standard set of items. The foods chosen depend on the time and place in terms of whatever happens to be the cheapest item in that particular time, in that particular place. So it usually selects seasonal or locally available foods. I mean, using a list of foods that are locally available, and therefore it provides a conservative estimate that's a lower bound on the cost per day of achieving these diets. And if you add preferences beyond this lower bound, the least cost diets, or if you add factors like convenience, it would only add to this cost. So this is really a lowest bound. Next slide. This is a demonstration of, you can see in India, in different states in India, how we found that there are a lot of similarities across states and what tends to be the least cost fruit highlighted here, like bananas show up in every state as the least cost fruit, but it's not always the same three. In some places there is guava, in other places there's pineapple or papaya. So you can see different items appear as the least cost items in different places. Next. And to just show a visual graphic of these three diets together, these different prices create a ladder of affordability, whereas the first step is mere calorie adequacy for short-term subsistence, then moving on to meeting nutrient needs, essential nutrient needs, avoiding deficiencies and excesses. And then beyond that, moving towards healthy diet patterns, meeting food group recommendations. And then beyond that, meeting other goals, such as convenience and preferences. And it's not that if healthy diets are affordable, everyone will automatically eat them. We know that's not true. But when healthy diets are unaffordable, food prices are an insurmountable barrier to improving diet quality. So our work is really here to highlight for whom healthy diets are just not accessible in the market. Because in that case, no amount of nutrition education is going to allow those households or individuals to access healthy diets if they are too far out of reach, out of affordability. and there's no alternatives that may not be costed, such as insects, available. So we want to highlight that, minimum cost of each of these steps before we can move on to convenience and preferences. So I am going to hand over to Rachel now, who's going to take you through types of food price data and then some of the methods and the ways that we have used these metrics across countries.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Gilbert. I'm really excited to be here. I attended this Learning Lab in person in Accra a couple of years back, and I've been following this work for a long time, and I'm really grateful to be a part of this team. As Anna mentioned, I'll now just talk through some different types of food price data, which is at the core of the metrics. So to start, a common source of food price data comes from household expenditure surveys. Things like the Household Income and Expenditure Survey, or the HIAS, the Integrated Household Surveys, or Living Standards Measurement Surveys. These commonly ask households about food consumption and the sources of food. So whether a household has purchased food or produced it themselves, received it as a gift, and often use the expenditures that are spent on purchased items to calculate food prices or a food unit cost. These surveys are exceptionally useful. The price data can be time-consuming to work with. There's diverse measurement units and food quality, but an important caveat to working with price data from household surveys is that these surveys are commonly done 5 to 10 years apart in countries. So they're not a very frequent source of data, but they provide an exceptional benefit in that they allow a researcher or a person interested to calculate expenditure shares on foods, food groups, and individual food items. Another source of food price data are market information systems. So these commonly track farm gate or wholesale food prices, so those faced by farmers or producers or traders, unlike retail prices like those faced by consumers in a market. So these can be quite different when you're factoring in transport costs and storage costs, for example. An important caveat to this type of food price data is that they often don't include things like packaged or processed foods, which like milk or cheese, which can be very important for consumers. But they can be a very useful source of price data for other purposes. And they can, particularly for the agricultural sector. You may also be familiar with food price data from vulnerability assessment systems or early warning systems, which collect consumer prices to guide emergency interventions. These systems, again, extremely useful and very important for guiding these interventions, but they often collect a smaller number of prices for fewer items, often staple foods, and collect fewer prices for diverse and perishable foods that are really important for healthy diets. Another small caveat is that the methodologies may differ between different vulnerability assessment systems. And the last source of food price data on this slide that I want to talk about is the World Bank's International Comparison Program dataset, which is a dataset of global prices. I want to talk about this in part because it's the data source that's used for some of the global work that was included in the 2020 UN Multi-Agency Report, the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, or the SOFI. But it's really a wonderful data set. It's a very unique data set put together first and foremost by the World Bank for estimating purchasing power parity for the world's economies. The most recent rounds were conducted in 2005, 2011, and 2017. So like the household expenditure survey data, these are not done frequently because they're such a tremendous effort. But the ICP 2017 global item list included 208 food and beverage items, plus additional specific food items in different regions. So I want to point out that this data set is very, very rich and very high quality with a lot of items, but the items are limited to those which are highly comparable products, which are sold across multiple countries. And that's important for the purchasing power parity calculations. This data set ultimately provides one national annual average price per item. So it's useful for the global comparisons that we're talking about, but often doesn't allow for the nuance at the sub-national level or include all of the items that might be relevant for a specific country or region. Now, another important source of price data that we can use for national level work is food price data collected by national governments for what's called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. We've been hearing a lot about this with tracking inflation. The CPI is used to track inflation and is part of existing national data collection systems in most countries. Most governments collect a lot of high frequency data, usually on a monthly or a quarterly basis and in representative market locations. So again, this is a tremendous effort to collect food prices that's already underway. And a wonderful source or piece of information about the CPI data is that these items, because the CPI is generally weighted by the share of total expenditures on food items, these lists include foods which are by definition culturally acceptable and commonly consumed. So these lists include the foods that are important to people in those countries, and they include many of the nutrient-dense foods like fruits or vegetables or animal source foods, protein-rich foods that we want to think about when calculating the cost of healthy diets. I'll also emphasize here that the intention of this project is to leverage the huge amount of food price data that's already being collected, because so many people in the world are already making quite an effort, and we want to leverage this data for nutrition. So while many people are working on specific projects or in different contexts and may find uses for other types of food price data, like the ones we've talked about previously, our intention in this project is to leverage existing data systems. So it's exciting to have a source of trusted official government data that can be used to inform policy. And many of you may be thinking to yourselves, well, maybe I want to have or use my own data, or you're thinking about collecting your own data. So what you would be thinking about most likely are retail prices that would be collected within a research study or a project or maybe a monitoring system. Some important things to think about is that the data should include several different items from each food group, which are of standard quality. So not the most discounted items, not the premium items, the highest quality items. The food items should be commonly consumed items that people in lower income households would be buying. So you want to make sure that we're focused on those people who are vulnerable to the cost of these food items. Another important rule of thumb, if you want to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, which we'll talk about more in a moment, you'd need at least 20 to 30 foods. If you want to calculate the cost of a nutrient adequate diet, or the CONA, which uses linear programming, you would need at least about 60 foods. So when you have smaller numbers of food items, you tend to omit important nutrient-rich and low-cost items that would be available in the market. So later on in the session, as you know, we'll be doing an activity. And as you're doing that, you can think about how you might use your own data, or perhaps CPI data, if you had access to that, to calculate these costs. Now, we'll go quickly to a poll. And the first question we want to hear from you about is, do you currently have your own research or project data that you would like to use for calculating these metrics? So if you can just write your answer in the poll here. I'm seeing we have currently most people, about close to 70%, are saying no, they do not have their own research or project data that they're planning to use. So we have a couple people saying maybe, I don't know, and about 20% saying yes, they do. Okay, great. I can end this poll and share the results. And our next question here is, are you thinking of either collecting your own data or using existing household survey data to calculate these metrics? Let's see, I think you should be able to see the poll. Great. So about 70%, again, saying yes, they are thinking of collecting their own data or using existing household survey data to calculate these metrics. Great, yeah. 15% saying, I don't know, and that's great, that's okay. It's what we're here to talk about today. So great, I'll end this and thanks. Great to hear from you guys. That's really helpful for knowing what you guys are interested in working on. Okay, so the next thing is we'll talk through in more detail the actual diet cost and affordability metrics and the methods. And I'll start by talking about calculating the cost of nutrient adequacy. So in order to calculate the cost of nutrient adequacy, we take the food price data that we've just been talking about, so any of those sources, and combine it with food composition data, which gives information about calorie and nutrient content of foods. So imagine you have a list of food prices from CPI data, for example. You would match each food with its nutrient and energy content from the food composition tables. And then we use linear programming to find the cheapest or lowest cost solution or answer to the question, which combination of foods can meet all of the nutrient and energy requirements that we have set at the lowest cost? And linear programming is done using some statistical or data analysis software to run, and it must take into consideration all of the possible diet combinations and determine which is the cheapest combination. So it's running quite a lot of these estimations and deciding on the cheapest one. So you're probably familiar, as we've mentioned, with some other initiatives that use this similar method, like the cost of the diet for Save the Children and the World Food Program. So many of you may have heard of this. For the energy and nutrient requirements that go into the linear programming model, the nutrient adequate diet starts with energy requirements or caloric needs, which are based on energy requirements, based on age, sex, weight, height, and physical activity. I won't go into too much detail here because there's quite a lot of detail in this wonderful resource that Anna and our colleague Kate Schneider put together. So I encourage you to look at that for more detail. But after the energy requirements, you can move on to the lower and upper limits for macronutrients like proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. So these are determined by looking at the range, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which specifies a range of acceptable proportions of energy for each macronutrient. Then for micronutrients, as Anna mentioned earlier, we need to set the lower bounds to avoid a deficiency of important micronutrients and an upper bound to avoid toxicity. There's, again, a couple of different sets of possible bounds, for example, estimated average requirements or upper limits. But again, these are described in more detail in this resource, and I encourage you to take a look at that. But these are the inputs into the linear programming model, which then solves to find the combination and quantities of foods that meet these requirements at the lowest cost. For calculating the cost of a healthy diet, it's a little bit different. So to measure the cost of a healthy diet, the first thing is that we have to define or operationalize what a healthy diet is. So we all know that there's no single definition of a healthy diet, but we can talk about this, we can think about this as a recommended diet based on quantitative food-based dietary guidelines. Anna has done an amazing amount of work on the food-based dietary guidelines. She'll talk about that a little bit more later, but almost 100 countries in the world have food-based dietary guidelines. And fortunately, the FAO has also done an amazing job of compiling this information into an online repository that tracks national food-based dietary guidelines. So again, about 100 countries in the world have them. And while there's no single definition there's a lot of convergence. There's a lot of broad similarities across the existing guidelines. And in order to use these, we need to use the quantitative guidelines. So some of these are qualitative or have more general advice, but the quantitative guidelines are what allow us to cost out what a healthy diet would cost. So we need to know things like how many servings are recommended per day and serving size. So not all food national guidelines have this information. A quick question for you, again, in the poll. As far as you know, does the country where you live or perhaps where you work have its own food-based dietary guidelines? I think we can, great, have the poll up. So please respond to the poll. Let us know if the country where you live or work has its own food-based dietary guidelines. Great. It looks like about 75% of people say yes, and a couple people saying they don't know, about 15% saying no. Great. And for those of you who say, maybe I don't know, again, the FAO repository is a wonderful resource. We'll end this poll now. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Great. Great. So again, to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, you need 3 pieces of information. You need to know food groups, you need to know the amount of food that's required per day, and you need the prices of a diversity of foods in each of the food groups, including the items which are commonly consumed by lower income people. And we'll practice that using the 3 pieces of information in the activity. But here, for looking at the amount of food required per day, we have the Benin Dietary Guidelines. So this is a great example of a detailed quantitative food-based dietary guideline. And there's 3 great pieces of information here. So first, we have the food groups. You can see for this dietary guideline, there are 5 groups. We have cereals and tubers, meat, fish, beans, and other protein-rich foods, vegetables, fruits, and milk products. Then this dietary guideline also provides the number of servings or portions of each food group that are recommended per day. So Benin, you can see there's different, they have different guidelines for different age groups and for men and women, but these provide the number of portions or servings recommended per day. And then finally, they provide information about the grams per portion or per serving, which is another key component that we can get from quantitative food-based dietary guidelines. And again, Anna's going to talk a little bit in more detail later about how we can do this in the activity, and you guys will be able to practice. And here, I just want to show you some beautiful images of the food-based dietary guidelines. Here are 10 quantitative national food-based dietary guidelines. There's a lot of similarities, again, between these guidelines. And in the database that we're going to share with you later for the activity, for each of these food-based dietary guidelines, we have pre-specified the amount of each food item that would be needed to meet the food group requirement for the food group that it's in. So this database, which we'll be talking about more, is a living document. As more quantitative food-based dietary guidelines are created in the future or when they're updated, we can also update this database. So for example, Sri Lanka is currently updating its guidelines. And lastly, I want to talk about affordability of diets, which is an important part of the metrics for this project. Affordability is a comparison of cost to a defined income standard. So one possible standard that we can use to compare the cost of the healthy diet is national or international poverty lines. So many of you will be familiar with the international poverty line, which is about $1.90. We have other options like using food expenditures as an income standard. We can look at total income. And in some cases, we've used wages. So we can compare the diet cost to wages. And that was done in India and Ethiopia. We can share some of those results later. These decisions are really context specific. It depends what population you're interested in and also what data is available. Another quick poll. As far as you know, does the country where you live have a national poverty line? Let's see. Wait for some answers to come in. Yes, for about 80% of you. A couple people saying no. About 20% of people saying maybe or I don't know. Great. Yeah, so a national poverty line is a really helpful standard for calculating affordability. Great. And now in the chat box, we want to have a little bit more discussion about the meaning of affordability. So thinking about your own food spending or your household's food spending, if you can think about what you spend per person, do you spend more than $1.90 per person on food for a single day? I know it's a little bit tough with the, maybe some of you are trying to convert into US dollars right now, but it'd be great to see in the chat what you all think, or you can also provide a little bit more detail if you like. I guess we could have done that as a poll. Great. We'll do the next one as a poll. Sorry about that. Great. Yeah, absolutely. Way more. Some people are saying, a lot of people are saying yes, right? So it's really interesting to think about for yourself, is this a standard that you would be able to meet? And this is just thinking about, we're talking about food spending. And really the international poverty line of $1.90 a day is really for food and non-food items. So for the next question, think about all of your expenses: food, housing, rent, transportation, maybe education, any other necessities, maybe even discretionary spending like entertainment, things you do for fun. About what percentage of your total expenses do you spend on food? Now I've really gotten us confused. We should not do that as a poll. Let's do that one in the chat. Great. So if you had to estimate, what percentage of your total expenses do you think you spend on food? 25, we're getting 35. Great. Interesting. About 40, 15%. Yeah, really interesting. 30%, 20%. Right. So anywhere between 15 and 45% people are putting in the chat. Great. All right. So thinking about affordability in different contexts is really important. Thinking about what is within reach of people in different countries, whether we're thinking about national poverty lines or this international poverty line that we've come to think of as you know, the standard. So now I want
maybe I can jump in to say, Rachel, sorry, just in comparison to what everyone's writing in the chat about their percent of income spent on food, and Jody's comment, I don't know, which means I'm very lucky, which is very true. If you don't know, it is not probably a constraint for your diet. The lowest income consumers in low income countries on average spend about 63% of income on food as a comparison.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, that's a really helpful comparison. Great. So right now we're going to jump into some results and some applications at the national level to get you all thinking about how you might apply this in your own work, and to share as well some of the global results. So what I hope you'll take away from these next slides is that the diet cost and affordability metrics that we've been talking about can be used in a variety of ways to answer questions at the regional level, at the national level, and even at the global level. So, and of course, we can even go lower than the regional level. But there's a lot of flexibility to use food price data and these metrics in particular to investigate different aspects of agricultural policy, nutrition, health. So feel free to keep thinking through how you might apply this to your own work. Let's see. So I'll start by demonstrating how least cost diets and food prices can be used to look at variation across space. And this work, which was led by Felipe Dizon and Anna at working in Pakistan. So this was using monthly price data. The data here are from actually city level data from 2017 that's collected by the National Bureau of Statistics. And in this case, the cost of a healthy diet was estimated at about 87 Pakistani rupees, which is about $1.43 in 2011 dollars. So you can think about that in comparison to that the international poverty line. And this research found that more than half of individuals in Pakistan spent less on food than that, suggesting that healthy diets are not affordable for many. So you can see in the map here, the nominal price of achieving food-based dietary guidelines, this is the cost of a healthy diet, is highly variable. So you can see in the red, in those areas, that's where the diet is most expensive, and green where things are the least expensive. So using this type of data and being able to look at a map like this can really help target areas for further investigation or programming, recognizing that the reason why things are expensive in these places along the coast may be very different than the reason why things are expensive farther north. And in the process of calculating the cost of a healthy diet, you can also see which food groups are most expensive. So in this study, it was most expensive to meet the serving recommendations for dairy and for vegetables. So these food groups' costs had about double the variance of starchy staples in Pakistan. And that's really useful information for thinking about how can we bring these diets within reach? What foods should we focus on? It was also possible to look at which food groups' costs vary the most across regions. So those big differences between the green and the red districts, and in Pakistan, again, these were vegetables and dairy and fruits. And it may immediately pop into your mind that these are the foods which are more perishable. So they may not be as easily transported as dry goods like starchy staples or maybe pulses. So this type of information can help prioritize interventions or programs, maybe things to improve transportation or address perishability issues. And lastly, this study demonstrated in going through the food price data that the prices for dark green leafy vegetables, which are required in some food-based dietary guidelines, were seasonally missing in Pakistan. So this is a really interesting finding that might indicate that these foods are not available in markets. That's something for further investigation, but it's a really important insight because we're not only talking about affordability, we're also thinking about availability. Can people go to a market and find these foods and meet these dietary needs? And now I'll turn to some data on the cost and affordability of a healthy diet in India, where affordability was estimated relative to wages. This study was led by Kalyani Raghunathan of IFPRI. And the monthly food price data here was collected at the market level, and that was between 2001 and 2011. So really quite a vast amount of data, and used again to calculate the cost of a healthy diet. So this data was from, again, the government, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, with 101 food items. And the same data set had information on wages. So in order to assess affordability, healthy diet costs were compared to unskilled laborers' wages. So that was used as a proxy for wages for those living in poverty. And what was another really exciting part of this data set is that the wage data was disaggregated for men and women, as are the Indian National Food-Based Dietary Guidelines. So it was possible to calculate the cost of a healthy diet separately for men and women and to compare them to these gendered wages. This is really important because previous work or previous studies have shown that there are gender disparities in dietary intakes, in actual dietary intakes. And so this type of gender disaggregated diet cost data can help investigate this disparity more. So the graph here depicts the percent change in the cost of a healthy diet relative to wages. So the bars to the left of the center here demonstrate that diets are becoming more affordable. And you can see here in most states, healthy diets became more affordable for men over time. So the data for men is these darker, these black bars, and you can see that the majority of them are to the left of the graph again. So the diets are becoming, the healthy diet is becoming more affordable between 2001 and 2011. In contrast, you can see on the other side of the graph here that in some states, the cost of a healthy diet relative to wages was increasing dramatically for women. So again, the gray bars demonstrate the ratio for women. And you can see some really large increases in certain states here. And then overall, this study was able to look at the percentage of people who couldn't afford the diet, and that was between 60 and 75% in different places in 2011. And as a last national example, I just want to talk about household survey data, because again, this is a very common source of food price data. Some of you may be thinking about this. And at the time of the study, there was no national consumer price index data available. But the data here came from the 2016 survey, in which prices can be derived from household food expenditures. So the prices are calculated from purchased items. And this data covers about 45,000 households. So here, the cost of the healthy diet was estimated at around 58 Bangladeshi taka, or again, about $1.70 in 2011 US dollars. So the household expenditure data is really useful, as we mentioned earlier, because you can determine affordability as well as compare the least cost diet with actual food group expenditures. So in this graph here, in this figure, you can see the cost of a healthy diet on the left. It's labeled CORD, or cost of a recommended diet. And then on the right here, we have actual expenditures by food group. So if we just focus in on the orange here, which is the protein foods, you can see that the least cost way to meet protein foods costs about 20 cents US dollars. And actual expenditures were much higher. So this gets back to the idea of how food preferences and adding in other needs do change the cost. They add to the cost. And it's very possible to incorporate food preferences into these metrics. So there's a method called the cost of a healthy diet incorporating food preferences, or CORD FP, which was demonstrated in Myanmar, and that was done using household survey data. So now just quickly to broaden our view, now that we've looked at specific national and subnational analyses using country level data and household survey data, these estimates are from the global analysis from the 2020 SOFI report. And this uses that the International Comparison Program World Bank data set, which is used for global comparisons. And what was found here is that 3 billion people globally lack sufficient income to purchase least cost healthy diets. So we can really see the magnitude of the problem here. And when looking at the percentage of the population that cannot afford just the energy sufficient diet, so that baseline benchmark of meeting calorie needs, we can see that calorie affordability is still a problem in some countries. Then when we move to the nutrient adequate diet, looking at the percent of the population that can't afford the nutrient adequate diet, the map changes. You can see that most people in sub-Saharan Africa cannot afford nutrient adequate diets. So we're getting these darker red colors showing a higher percentage of the population that cannot afford nutrient adequate diets. And then finally, we can look at the population that cannot afford the healthy diet. So we're on that third step of the ladder. And most people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia cannot afford healthy diets. So again, you see the number of countries in the world that are getting that darker shade of red, a higher proportion of people who can't afford the diet is really increasing here as we get towards the healthy diet. So finally, the work done in the SOFI report showed that healthy diets, by any definition, are far more expensive than the entire international poverty line. You can see here that the cost of healthy diets for 10 different national food-based dietary guidelines were estimated, in addition to the Eat Lancet guidelines. The median of these costs was $3.75 per person per day. So that's actually much higher than, $3.50 per person per day, which is much higher than the $1.90 a day international poverty line that includes food and non-food items. And the difference is, of course, even larger if you're looking at the upper bound of that international poverty line that can credibly be reserved for food. It's about $1.20. So these are the kinds of really important insights and realizations that food price data and diet costs can bring about right now at the global level, but also at the national level, as we've seen. We're excited to hear how you guys are thinking of incorporating these diet costs into your work. We can start to think about how best to set social safety nets, or how we can bring people to a place where they can afford these diets and increase availability of healthy foods. So I think right now we're going to turn to a little bit of discussion. I'll stop talking for a bit, and I think, Will, you're going to lead this discussion a little bit.
Excellent, thank you. So I was just typing madly in the chat box with so many interesting comments and questions. So I hope people are able to scroll up and down the chat box. The one limitation of the chat box is that it is linear. So you have to sometimes jump up to see the previous person. And I hope that the @ symbol can help you find the name of the person. So for this chat now, the question is to get some insights about these questions here, where we're dividing the world of food price for nutrition research into two. The first two questions are about global, comparing cross countries. The second is about subnational, comparing within countries. And Anna, you're looking quizzical. Am I going astray here? Is that good? So what we wanted was to get the insights from those who have had opportunities to work with some of these data in the past, to think about what have you found useful and what have you found less useful on the global side, first two questions, and then subnational in the second two questions. Now, these are really crucially different. I'm going to say a few words of framing. So first of all, on the global side, when we're comparing across countries, the key insight is that different countries have different currencies, different comparisons. And this gets to what was raised in the chat by Priyanka, who said, how does it matter if people are using barter or even not trading with anyone else, just using their own labor, their own land, their own water, their own resources to trade off between the fruits and vegetables they might grow, the beans, a bit of maize, a bit of cassava in their backyard, maybe they have a chicken, and they're using their labor and adjusting the labor between how much time they spend on the plot of beans, how much time they spend on the plot of corn or maize, how much time they spend on their vegetables, and also maybe tending a goat, getting some goat milk, maybe tending a chicken, getting some eggs. So you're trading off, and what we've found is that in those trade-offs of time, people adjust their time because they have imagination and agency. People adjust their time to have about the same ratio of the cost of egg to cost of vegetables, to cost of beans, to cost of maize. That ratio of the costs is what we use in our analyses globally and also within countries when we're thinking about the own production in someone's home garden, the wild food environments that Anna mentioned, and the market food environments that we're looking at through the market prices. And so the key insight is that the relative cost, the price of one thing compared to something else, we use market prices because we're asking, does the market deliver? Does the food system, as influenced by government policy, by investments, by the actions of the private sector that may or may not be regulated or incentivized to deliver a healthy diet, we're asking, does the market work? And individual households then in their own choices are adjusting, and the relative cost of eggs to fruits to vegetables to beans to a starchy staple, we find those are very consistently similar between the different food environments that a household chooses because people have agency and they adjust within each category. So when we look across countries and we ask about the relative costs of different foods, and we add them up and compare them to income for affordability, what have you found most useful? And enter that in the chat box. And then the next question will be, what have you found least useful? Okay, so some of you will have nothing to say, you haven't thought about this. Others have thought about this a lot, right? And have some, I hope, very interesting insights to share. So let's start with the most useful. What have you seen that you found most remarkable, most insightful, most of an aha moment of saying, whoa, that's interesting when we compare across countries and we think about food prices for nutrition around different African countries, South Asian countries, all countries in the world. This was a principal theme of the SOFI. What have you found that you liked? So I'll give you a moment just to type in the chat box, and we'll see as many insights as folks want to share. If people are not keen to type positive insights, also share, if you'd like, the least useful things that you've seen, the most confusing, the most maybe even misleading, where we have a result and you're saying like, I don't agree with that. Are there any aspects of the global analyses? So Carlos writes, the affordability is relative to where you are in the world. Shirisha writes, the actual diet cost versus the affordable diet cost. Just how far out of reach healthy diets are. For many in the lowest income places, they are very, very far out of reach. So let me share a few things while folks are typing. Type anything you find most attractive or maybe misleading or unattractive or just confusing. I'll say a few things while folks are typing. One is that incomes, the average national income across countries in the world, varies by a factor of about 100. From the poorest country in the world, where average total income, meaning the sum of everything they produce, is about $2 a day, to the richest countries, such as Singapore, Qatar, or Luxembourg, or small communities, very, very wealthy, they would have income around 200. So a factor of 100, from $2 a day average total country income per person to 200, a factor of 100, a 100-fold difference in the average. Then within countries, you often have another 100-fold difference between the poorest within and the poorest without. In contrast, diet costs vary by a factor of 2 or 3, meaning 2 or 3 times. So much less variation in diet costs because food is exchanged, food is traded. As I was saying, people have agency, people have imagination. They say, I could buy and sell, I could move, I could do this instead of that. And so people do, and as a result, food prices are quite similar, but incomes vary hugely. If you live in a very low income setting, your opportunities to make a lot of money, very limited. High income countries, higher incomes, and those are huge differences within and across households. So income swamps prices in terms of affordability, but there is still that 2 or 3-fold variation in food prices. That pivots to the next topic, which is subnational. Because when we look subnationally, we're looking at a population that's in the same environment in terms of livelihoods, in terms of natural resource availability for farm families, in terms of the infrastructure, education, and job opportunities for everyone. And so income levels are more similar within countries, even though there might be a 10, as I said, a 10 or even 100-fold difference between lower and higher income within a country. That is much narrower than it is across countries in the world. And so we're looking at where the variation in diet cost is much more important. Where within countries, we have seen, as I said, a 2 or 3-fold variation in diet costs, with significant variation in terms of seasons, with significant variation in terms of hotspots, of locations with very high prices, and locations with relatively low prices. Most of the variation we see is actually between seasons and between countries, between seasons and between years when you're looking within a country. So any thoughts on most useful or least useful insights on the subnational side within countries?
I can read one from the chat here. We have Monique saying, at the subnational level, comparing urban versus rural affordability is vital, especially in the global South. Great point. Yeah, we have a lot of people mentioning looking at regional disparities or subnational levels, making sure that you can capture those differences. And we have another comment here. about disaggregation by types of food production systems. So currently there's not disaggregation by the types of food production system, which could be important for sustainability metrics. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. Keep writing, we can keep highlighting some of these.
These question of different costs in different production systems or different food environments, as Anna mentioned, the wild food environment, of course, the home produced, home gardens and home agriculture, and then sub-communities where people are trading within a village, eggs for vegetables, trading fruits. People who have the fruit trees will trade their fruits for other people's vegetables, just barter within a village. And of course, there's a lot of gift exchange occurring everywhere where people just share with each other, and in addition, safety nets. And that's very, very interesting to zoom in and see these price differences. Again, those price differences are relatively small. So because people can move fruits around and vegetables, trade them from one person to another, precisely because people have agency and imagination, they act on their opportunities. And to the extent that people have opportunities, you end up with similar prices in a given place for different people from different sources because they can trade. But you definitely have seasonal variation and of course, spatial variation, especially in remote places that we pick up. There's been a number of things in the chat box about COVID-19 and how COVID really broke a lot of the connections in terms of markets. Food markets were among the first to reopen or stay open. Some governments, though, had draconian movement restrictions that were a terrible cause of, first of all, spreading COVID because people had to move and go home or something like that instead of sheltering in place, and also disrupted food markets. And we are getting some data on those kinds of disruptions. And of course, climate change generally, we're looking at things like storms and disruptions to food markets caused by extreme weather. Excellent. So I think it would be good to proceed on to the activity, because when you see how this works, and Anna and Rachel have prepared a really extraordinary opportunity to do that, I think a lot more insights will come forward. So thanks very much for everything in the chat box. Rachel, do you want to advance?
Yeah, thanks for this really rich discussion. Excuse me. And I think that we could continue having a discussion for another hour with so many great comments. And thanks, Will, for touching on so many of them really efficiently. And hopefully we'll have some more time at the end after this activity. But for now, we will move on to the activity, which is getting a chance now to actually calculate the cost of a healthy diet yourselves, so that when you have your own price data, or when you have a data set that you may have obtained working together with a national statistical organization or another data collector, you would be able to calculate the cost of a healthy diet with that price data set. So this slide has the basic steps, conceptually, what's needed for calculating the cost of a healthy diet. First of all, when you have a food price data set, the very first thing to do is go through and ensure your food price data is in standard units. A lot of times there are non-standard units collected, which then have to somehow be converted into a standard like a price per kilogram or price per liter. You know, if something is collected in terms of a heap or a bunch, the way to do this is either get the information from the data collector if it's not yourself, or take a scale to the market and actually weigh what those items, what a heap means in terms of kilograms. Then once you have all of the items in standard units, the price per kilogram, you go through your list and categorize each food in the price list according to food groups, according to the dietary guideline you want to employ for this analysis. And you'll see an example of this in a minute. So once you have chosen a dietary guideline, you assign each item in your food list to the appropriate food group for that guideline. And then the next step is then calculating the price per day for each item. So that is a process that requires, first of all, your price per kilogram, but then it also requires the quantity required per day, also in kilograms, and accounting for the edible portion in order to calculate, how much does it cost to meet the recommendation for that food group if you consume this particular item. And that's a stumbling block for a lot of users. So we have designed a database to help with this, where you can look up the item and find the quantity that's required for each item that incorporates those aspects of both recommendation and edible portion. So then once you have, so you first converted your price data to a standard unit, and now you have converted it into price per amount recommended per day. And when you have it at that level, you can then select the least cost items in each food group. Some food groups would require just one item, such as oils and fats. There's no requirement for a diversity of oils and fats, but other items require diversity, such as vegetables, which require, we set a standard of at least 3 unique vegetables, because diversity is part of the recommendation. And once you have selected the least cost items in each food group, they get summed all together to calculate the total cost of a healthy diet, or CORD. Next slide. So we'll go through this step by step, because we have a new tool to facilitate this calculation, which is a database of food item quantities required for computing the cost of a healthy diet. We can paste this into the chat. You'll be using this today. And this is the version 1, as you see. It is an initial list with an initial set of dietary guidelines. We will be updating this as we find new guidelines, new items, errors. If you see errors, if you see things that would be easier, let us know, so that we can continue to improve and update this database to facilitate everyone to be able to calculate the cost of a healthy diet. So this version 1 contains 11 different quantified food-based dietary guidelines. The 10 that were used in the SOFI report, plus an additional one that we were able to add on, which is Indonesia. Then it also contains the healthy diet basket, which I'll go into more depth on a later slide. But essentially, the healthy diet basket is an average of the 10 dietary guidelines that we calculated for the global analysis in the SOFI, looking at those 10 guidelines, which represent the majority of the people in different regions of the world, putting those together in an average basket that can be applied across countries. And then also the database contains the 4 different Eat Lancet diet patterns. And for each of these sets of guidelines, for each item in the database, so say mangoes, it will give you, for that guideline, the recommended quantity to consume to satisfy the food group recommendation. So for example, if you if the recommendation is to consume 300 grams of fruits per day, then for mango, it would say 0.3 kg. That's the total recommendation for the entire food group, before we take into account that there's more than one food required in that food group. So that's what you'll see in the recommended quantity per day to consume. Then we also have the recommended quantity per day to purchase to satisfy the food group recommendation. So this is the really important number, because this is what it would cost to go to the market and get that item enough to consume to meet the recommendation. So if it's mangoes, you can't eat the mango skin or the mango pit. And so that is not edible portion. So we have to purchase more than 300 grams of mango to consume 300 grams of mango. So we incorporate that inedible portion to get the amount purchased, to be able to find the cost of what it takes to purchase that amount. So we also then, for each guideline, have the food group classification to know that mango is classified as a fruit. And that's actually true in all guidelines. There's some items that differ by guideline. For example, Avocados are sometimes called a fruit, sometimes a vegetable, and sometimes a fat in different countries' guidelines. So we'll have the food group classification. And this is actually coming soon. It's not quite there yet, but the number of foods to select per food group will incorporate into version 2 of the database. So let's go to the next slide. So you have, if you haven't already downloaded the Excel file that Rachel pasted into the chat, when you download it, you'll see something that looks like this. So when you go to the database tab, you'll see that we have right in the center, the row that says FCT name, that means food composition table name, that is the item name as it appears in the food composition table used, which in most cases here is the USDA food composition table. And that's where you will look up any items you have on your list to match them to the items in the database. And to assist with that, we have in column B and C, the generic food category and generic food name, just to help, if you know that you're looking for a fruit, then you would go to the section with the generic food category called fruits. And then you would be likely to find your mangoes or apples, apricots in this section, so that it just facilitates looking through the list to search for that food match. And then in the colored columns, this starts off with the healthy diet basket, which is again the average across guidelines. You can find for the healthy diet basket here highlighted in yellow, the column G shows the food group for each item. The food group acronyms or abbreviations here are listed in the front matter. So there's a list of all the acronyms in this database in the front matter tab. So PSP in this case means plant source protein rich food. F means fruit. And that's again in the list of acronyms. And you can see in column H, the recommended quantity to consume. So if we're looking at apples, that's 0.25 kg, so 250 grams per day to meet the dietary pattern. And then if you look at column I, the recommended quantity to purchase, that factors in that edible portion. And you see that you'd have to purchase 0.278 kilograms of apples to get enough fruit to meet that recommendation. So this is the information you'll use in combination with your food price data to calculate the cost of each item to select least cost items for the cost of the food group. Then to the right of the healthy diet basket, you see other columns in blue, which are the National Food-Based Dietary Guidelines. And you can scroll through and see all the guidelines. If you wanted to use Argentina's guideline, the amounts are there. If you wanted to use India's guideline, the amounts are there. And then the Eat Lancet recommended amounts are towards the end of the database. And next slide. So to say a little more about the healthy diet basket, this is a streamlined method for cross-country comparisons. So when selecting, just to step back a little bit, when you're trying to select an appropriate dietary guideline to apply to come up with the cost of healthy diet, it may be very obvious. Perhaps you're working in Benin. So you clearly want to find how many people are able to afford the government's recommendation for healthy diets in the Benin food-based dietary guidelines. So then you can select that set of guidelines and find the appropriate amounts. In other cases, it's a little less clear. So, say you're in Togo and there's no national dietary guideline. Well, you could use a neighboring country like Benin. Or you could decide you want to use this, something that is for looking across countries and not specific to a single set of guidelines. And you might choose the healthy diet basket. And this is a good option if you are trying to make comparisons across countries as well, because it doesn't work to select, one guideline in one country and a different guideline in a different country, because those guidelines themselves may be slightly different in cost, so they're not comparable. So it's better to use the same standard for making comparisons. So for the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report last year, we calculated 10 different guidelines and took the average cost across all 10, as Rachel went over earlier. And so what we came up with for the global median cost was really, it wasn't associated with any identifiable set of food or identifiable set of gram amounts. It was an average cost only, a cost of kind of a latent diet pattern. So when people would ask, what is it the cost of? There's no specific food items or amounts that it is. It was just the average across all 10 different guidelines. So next slide. And that's what you saw earlier, where that was more than $3.50 for the median cost. But then instead of looking at the median cost, to make it simpler and to make it more concrete, to say, okay, what does that actually mean in terms of food groups and food items? Instead of taking each guideline and then taking the median cost, we can instead take each guideline and find the average amount of each food group across guidelines and find the cost of that. So next slide. You can kind of imagine looking back at these guidelines, so these are all the food guides representing the quantified guidelines. If you imagine making them transparent and laying them on top of each other, and sort of superimposing these food groups, and you start to see a pattern emerge where there's a sort of an average amount of grain foods, a sort of average amount of protein-rich food items, and an average amount of fruits and vegetables. That's what the healthy diet basket is. It's really looking across all these guidelines, what's the average amount of different food groups coming out. Next slide. And so you can kind of see that these pie charts are not as pretty as the National Dietary Guidelines, but the gram distribution is there on the chart on the left, and then the calorie distribution. Usually what you see in the food guide is more like the gram distribution, where you have what a sort of stylized plate might look like between starchy staples, protein-rich foods, dairy and its substitutes, fats, vegetables, and fruits. And these are the food groups which are, they appear in almost all guidelines and are quite universal in their relevance. And for the dairy category, we do include dairy substitutes because in not all cultures are dairy items an important part of the diet. It can be in terms of small fish, or like in the China guidelines, there's, soy and tofu are in the same group. So there are dairy substitutes as well. Next slide. Okay, so for the activity itself, we have another Excel file in addition to the database. Rachel has just pasted it in with so go ahead and download that activity file. It has a set of instructions, and once you have read those, you can go back and forth between the instructions and the activity sheet. You'll work in groups of 4 in breakout rooms. So you can ask each other questions if there's anything that's unclear, you can help each other out. And the next slide. What you'll see in this activity is the gray columns are those which you will fill in. So they're, for the interest of time, we've mostly filled them in for you. If you started with just a food price data set, you'd have to fill them all in by looking each item up in the database. You can see in column H, the matching notes, where the item, so column E has the original food item from the food price list. And then column H has the item it was matched to in the database. And when you find a food match, you will fill in the food group in column B and the number of foods to select per food group, match it to the other items in that food group. So for example, if you fill in something that's also a starchy staple, it requires 2 different foods within that food group as listed in the other starchy staples. And then you'll also look up the recommended quantity to purchase per day to meet the food group recommendation and fill it in for the missing cells of column G. A note on food matching, they may not be totally exact. So that's part of the challenge. Try your best to find an item that is most similar to the item on the food list. Next. So once you have matched the foods to the best of your ability and entered the food groups, you can then do the process of selecting which ones are the cheapest in each food group. And so again, if the number of items to select is listed in column C, so for starchy staples, there are 2 items to select in that food group. And so in column J, you'll want 2 ones, 2 cells where you write 1 for the cheapest items in that food group, cheapest in terms of the amount in column G, the recommended quantity to purchase. To facilitate this, it might be helpful to sort the data. So in the next slide, it just shows sorting in Excel. You copy, you select the whole area within the dark outline. And when you've selected that area with your cursor, you can go to sort and filter. First sort by food group, then sort by the cost of sorry, I can't read it, it's too small. The cost of the recommended quantity per day in column I, that's where that comes from. And if you sort from smallest to largest, then it will help you to see very clearly which ones are the lowest cost. And then you select the appropriate number. Then the spreadsheet will automatically add up the cost of those food groups to find the total cost of a healthy diet. So I think that's it for the instructions. Are there any questions before we go into the breakout rooms? So everyone make sure, thanks Rachel. Yep, the instructions are listed in the instructions tab, and everyone make sure to download these 2 Excel files from the chat before you go into the breakout rooms.
And is everyone back, Julia? Yes, right?
Yeah, everyone should be back from their breakout room. So I'll pass back to you, Rachel.
Are we sure? Because there only seems to be 55 people. I don't know if that's just like attendance that's dipped.
Yes. There's a reasonable amount of drop off. Some of it's just technical. A lot. In our previous call, there was a lot of people who reported losing signal because people joined from amazing places.
Great. Do you want to go through this, Rachel? Or did you want me to lead this part?
I think either way is fine. I think we can give people a minute or so to think about, I don't know if people have questions that they gathered during the activity that they want to share now. I think I was popping between breakout rooms and I know that some people had some questions. So if people want to either post those in the chat or you can unmute and turn on your video and ask your question. If that's useful, we can do a couple questions or talk about what was difficult. And we're very open to some suggestions as well. So any of those things.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is pretty common across the rooms is that it wasn't enough time to finish the activity. So that's fine. You can continue to keep going through it and seeing what questions come up for you. You can also go to the activity file, and if you right-click on the activity tab and then click unhide, you'll see a new tab pop up which has the answers for the completed activity. So you'll see a box that comes up that says unhide activity complete, and click OK. And then you'll see the completed activity and the total cost. So if you were struggling to complete the activity, or if you were struggling with food matching, you can look at the final results in that tab. Maybe I could say a couple of kind of the learning points that people might have encountered right away when they went to match the food items. So with the first one on maize grain, something that came up in the breakout room where I was how to match that item, since there were many different kinds of maize grains in the database. So that definitely is a learning objective here of what to do in that case. So in food composition tables, which is where the item list comes from, the items tend to be quite specific because they're matched to specific nutrient contents. In this case, we're not calculating nutrient content. We mainly care what's the energy content and the edible portion of the item. So in this case, all of those different forms of maize grain would have approximately the same energy content, and they're all edible portion is 1. So you can select whichever one is most appropriate to the context where you are. In this case, it's Malawi. If you know something about Malawi, you'd select the one, maybe it's yellow or white, that's more common. It doesn't actually really matter that much, the specificity of the food match, just to make sure it seems right in terms of the general energy content and edible portion. And that came into play too for the pork item, where there's a bunch of different kinds of pork. So it'd be important to know what the form was in your food price data. They really differed in terms of edible portion, with some with bone, some without bone, and that makes the price vary quite a lot. So when you have an uncertain match, the first thing to do is find out more about what the item actually is in the food price data you have, so that you can match to the appropriate item. So I know we're running short on time. Are there other questions that have come up, or Will, maybe do you want to head into the last discussion section?
I can.
I wanted to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me. So I know, of course, like we're focusing on affordability, but what are some of the barriers to the food being affordable? Because I feel like what I've gathered so far is that a lot of affordability for these diets is relative. It's relative to where you are at in the world. It's relative to what the market price is, relative to, in comparison to like what the wage is. But what are the barriers to making it affordable?
Yeah, I think that's really crucial. So we're speaking of 2 kinds of metrics. Cost is amount per day in real terms. So it's money that's been converted into a common currency. So the relative cost of everything is compared to everything else. And that is a different level for different kinds of diets. It's about 75 US cents a day for subsistence. It's about $2 and between 2 and 3 for nutrients. And it's about $3.50 or $4 a day relative to all other costs for the cost of a healthy diet. So that's the dollars per day for a typical person. And then income or affordability relative to purchasing power, how much buying power, how many resources people have from either their own earnings or their farm income or their safety nets or their informal remittances, informal insurance, that is the affordability. And so, as you said, people have different amounts of empowerment, different amounts of purchasing power, and that really crucially is what. So we're measuring the ability of the food system to deliver an overall mix of foods within reach, where those costs differ by a factor of 2 or so along the ladder, and then incomes differ by a factor of 100 so incomes really drive whether in a village, in a community, a district, a state, or a country, and then across countries, this huge variance.
So does the question become like what drives income?
Exactly. So
that's a whole nother set of set of metrics and disciplines that it will take.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So what's come out of this work in the UN Food Systems Summit conversation is 2 action items, 2 things to do. The first thing is to make social protection or safety net programs nutrition smart, nutrition sensitive, nutrition oriented. What does that mean? It means having the cost of food and the cost of other items be the trigger for eligibility, and then have the delivery of the safety net be such that people can actually afford a healthy diet from the services delivered. And then the second action item is within the food system after that to make the investments necessary for fruits and vegetables and healthy foods to be available year round. So there are 2 different agendas, one on the affordability side where income matters most, and the other on the food prices side where the relative cost of different food groups can be influenced by
like maybe like if the government subsidizes like a crop or something to make it more affordable.
Potentially, but by far the largest instrument that affects things is the innovation, the common set of tools that people use. So that starts with the seed and genetics. Seeds and genetics varies enormously. The best performing eggplant to get a vegetable, the best performing tomatoes, the best performing any kind of, depends on the seed. So, you know, tens of thousands of years of seed selection and then hundreds of years of more scientific seed selection has given us the most beautiful eggplant, most beautiful brinjal, really, really much higher yield, more pest resistant than older brinjal. And that's true for every single species. So it starts with the seed, then the infrastructure, whether it's irrigation and so forth. Those are really big differences. And then infrastructure along the supply chain all the way to the store, including rural electrification for cold chains and so on and so forth. So those are the things that make prices vary by a factor of 2 or 3, you know, from the cheapest to the most expensive places and times of year. And that's extremely important, getting those prices down lower in that range. But of course, incomes vary by a factor of 100. And so,
yeah, right.
And so getting that safety net in place for the poorest is crucial on the affordability side.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that does answer my question.
Yeah, and so we have a case in point on the, you know, from Tayo. And so we really want to make sure we pivot to that. We have a half an hour actually remaining in total, and want to make sure we allocate that very valuable time all together in the most effective possible way. So Anna, has Tayo joined us back now?
Hello?
Yes, great.
Okay, yes, I'm here.
Do you want to, so Anna, do you want to introduce?
Well, thank you so much for being here, Tayo. And I'm a little confused on the time, if we have half an hour or if we're meant to be ending.
No, I was
wrong.
wrong.
We're actually at time. No, we're actually at time.
Right, we'll end at the top of the hour. Not now, but 1/2 hour from now.
Sorry, I think there's some confusion. I think we are meant to end now, and we're a little unprepared for that. So I apologize. But let's, maybe Tayo can close out the session with a couple brief words on how this metric is being put to use at national level, because it's a really good story. I apologize that we ran out of time for more discussion on this, but go ahead, Tayo, for a kind of final case study.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for having me. So the way we are using the cost of affordability of diets in Nigeria is to look at the food environment. So we have evidence that the food environment varies in different states across the country, and we have 37 states. And so these matrices are useful for us to sort of see how affordability of different foods vary. And then this is going to help us to be able to group states together so that we can better target the kinds of support and intervention that we give states. And one of the good things we have is that we are using price data from the Bureau of Statistics. So it gives us urban and rural data from states and for every month across several years. So we are also able to see how prices fluctuate in urban and rural areas across the months of the year. to look at seasonality of price, of affordability and the cost of healthy diets, and start to see what kind of changes we can have in the distribution of food and in some of these issues around increasing supply in areas where it shows that affordability really drops, or prices really go up rather at certain times of the year. Over, I think. Thank you.
Thanks for that abbreviated summary. It's actually a really fascinating case that it's, able to be put to use in these different contexts in the country. So we're really happy to be partnering together with you, Tayo. Thanks for your leadership, as well as others in the Federal Ministry of Ag and Rural Development and others. So we'll continue, hopefully have, some more to share next year on that when the metrics are really put in place. I'll hand it back to Will, if you want to say anything final before we close out the session. Apologies for the kind of time crunch at the end, which caught us off guard.
Yeah. So this has been a blur of many meetings on Zoom. Actually, we just had a previous Learning Lab, so it was my fault on confusion about the end time. But I think this has been a great discussion, and really want to thank Tayo, thank Anna, thank Rachel and Julia and the whole ANH Academy team for bringing us together. This is, for many of you, you've been involved. Thank you. We need to keep talking, keep doing things. Rachel is organizing country interest groups within countries. And then this kind of meeting is across countries. And then for those of you who are new to this, we are doing our best to create on-ramps and opportunities for people to learn, give you the tools, allow you to use these data. And we need to know, what do you find easy and what do you find hard? What do you find difficult? Let us know, and we'll do our best to make this accessible to you to analyze the problems that you're facing in your food systems. So thanks, and back to Rachel then.
Yeah, Julia can close us out, but I did put a Google form in the chat. You can connect with us either via the emails, which we put in the database and in the activity, or through that Google form. Give us feedback, reach out to us directly. As Will said, really looking for a lot of interaction and hoping to answer your questions and improve this database so it's as useful as possible. And we'll be holding these webinars throughout the summer. So we will definitely be broadcasting those invitations, and we hope you can join and hear more about like what Tayo's doing and other people are doing in individual countries. So Julia, I think you can close us out now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Anna, Rachel, and Will. This was incredibly interesting. I just wanted to direct everyone towards some of our other learning labs that we have available to other people throughout the rest of this week of ANH Academy Week. There'll be 3 other great learning labs that are open to everyone, and I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now for everyone to be able to check those out on the ANH Academy website. So thank you all very much for joining, and we hope you have a really good rest of your morning, evening, depending where you are in the world right now. So thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. This was an awesome learning lab. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
Have a good day.
Yeah,
it was awesome. I had a good time. Thank you.
Thanks. It's nice to see you here.
All right, guys. Bye.
Yeah, if everyone else wants to answer the poll going on right now, you can do that quickly before you log on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've answered the poll. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Like everyone answered the poll, so I'm gonna end the meeting now if there are no other questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Julia.
Thank you.